The morning the dispatch bag came back from Garraby, the frost had not yet left the gravel, and Mirabel Corburn was kneeling at the long oak table in the muniment room, with a year of unsorted letters spread before her like fallen leaves. She heard the front door, the stamp of a wet boot, the voice of the understeward saying that a parcel had been recovered from the coaching inn at the crossroads held there since the fever took the rider who carried it. She did not look up at once. She had learned, in her years of service to this house, that most arrivals were nothing, and that a woman who ran to every door was a woman who had not enough to do. Then she heard the word fever, and the word rider, and the date the understeward gave for when the bag had last been seen on its way, and she went very still. That date was the day the old Earl had died. She rose. Her knees ached from the cold floor, and her ink-stained fingers were stiff, and she crossed to the doorway, where the understeward stood holding a leather satchel gone green with damp, its buckle furred with rust, its weight uneven in his hands as though something inside had shifted and settled over the long months of waiting. She took it from him without asking leave. She was only the late Earl's archivist, the woman who copied his correspondence and kept his accounts and dusted the spines of his books, and she had no authority to take anything. Her hands moved before her caution could stop them, and the understeward, who had known her since she was a girl, in this house, let her. If you have ever waited a year to learn a thing you did not know you were waiting for, you will understand the silence that filled that room. Stay with it a moment, the way she did. Inside the satchel, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept the worst of the wet from it, was a single thick letter, sealed with the old Earl's own ring, addressed in the hand of the family solicitor in town. The direction read to the new Earl to be opened upon his lordship's death, and not before. The old Earl had been dead a year. The new Earl had held the title a year. And this letter, which was meant to have arrived the very week of the funeral, had sat in a wicker basket behind a coaching inn's counter, while a dead man's effects waited to be claimed. Mirabel held it, and did not break the seal. It was not hers to break. She turned it over in her hands all the same, and she saw beneath the direction, in the old Earl's own shaking late hand, 3 words added in pencil that the solicitor would never have written. They said only, "She must know. She must." The pronoun was a woman. And there was no woman, in the line of Ensley, who had any business with a sealed letter, meant for the heir, and to the household of Ensley, in the years since the old Earl had been carried to the family vault beneath the chapel, Mirabel was a useful fixture, and nothing more. To the gentry who came to dine when they noticed her at all, she was the late Earl's goddaughter, taken in out of charity when her father's small estate failed, kept on now as a kind of upper servant because she could read a ledger and mend a torn deed, and find any document in the great press of papers that no one else could navigate. The new Earl's aunt had a phrase for her, delivered once in the blue drawing-room to a visiting baroness, in a voice not meant to carry, but carrying all the same. The clerk girl, she had said, with a small downward turn of the mouth that the word clerk required. We keep her for the filing. The clerk girl. Mirabel had heard it through the half-open door, and had gone on copying the line she was copying, her pen steady, the loop of the letter she was forming not faltering by the breath of a hair. She did not permit herself the luxury of a flinch. A flinch was a thing the dowager could see, and a thing the dowager could see was a thing the dowager could use. She had not always been the clerk girl. There had been a house called Westcote, 3 counties distant, with a south lawn that ran down to a stream, and a father who read Latin to her in the evenings, and a mother she could not remember except as a warmth and a particular blue ribbon kept in a drawer. When her father died, and the small estate proved more debt than land, it was the old Earl, her godfather, who sent the carriage. He had loved her father, he said, when boys at school, and he kept his debts of the heart. He had given her a room in the north wing and the run of his library, and in time the keeping of his papers, and he had spoken to her as to an equal across the chessboard on winter evenings, and she had been in that strange, suspended way, almost happy. Then the cough had taken him in a single hard autumn, and the title and the house and every chair she sat in had passed to a cousin she had never met, and she had become the clerk girl, and the carriage that had once been sent for her was not, she understood, a carriage that would be sent again. The cousin who became the Earl was named Caspar Merivale, and he came to Ensley in mourning grey with the look of a man arriving at a debt rather than an inheritance. He was tall and spare and very contained, a jaw like the stone of the chapel front, eyes the color of rain on slate, and he spoke little and smiled, not at all in those first weeks. He had come on horseback rather than in the carriage sent for him, and Mirabel had watched from the muniment room window as he dismounted in the rain and stood a moment looking up at the great grey front of the house with an expression she had taken then for arrogance and understood later for dread. He had handed his own horse to the groom rather than wait to be relieved of it. He had asked his first hour in the house, not for refreshment but for the rent roll, and had sat with it until the candles burned down, and had said when the dowager pressed wine and consolation on him, only that he was obliged to her and would manage. The household decided he was cold. The dowager, who was his aunt by marriage and who had run the house in the interval, told everyone within reach that her nephew felt the weight of it deeply, and must be managed gently. And she managed everything herself, and Caspar let her, because a man drowning in account books and tenant grievances and 100 strangers' expectations does not always notice whose hand is on the tiller. What the household did not know, what Mirabel alone had cause to suspect, was that the new Earl had not wanted any of it. She knew it, because she kept his correspondence now as she had kept his predecessors, and because a man's letters tell the truth, his face will not. He wrote to his late brother's widow about a debt he meant to quietly settle. He wrote to a regiment's colonel about a sergeant's pension that was not his concern to pay, and that he paid regardless. He gave orders that were, when she copied them out, almost always shaped as protection, though he never once called them that. Repair the Hadlow cottages before the frost. See that the Penhale widow is not turned out. He issued these the way another man issues a cruelty, flatly, without warmth, as though warmth were a currency he had run short of and could not afford to spend. She told herself she did not study him. She studied everyone. It was her work to know the house. That she knew the particular way he stood at the long library window with his back to the room, one hand flat against the cold glass, as though testing whether the world outside were real, was merely a thing she had observed. That she knew he never sat in the old Earl's chair, not once in a year, but drew up a plainer one beside it, was a fact she had filed and not examined. She was the clerk girl. She filed things. She did not examine them. She had the letter in her apron pocket now, and she went to find him. He was in the library, of course, with the rent roll open and unread before him and the grey morning light, making a ghost of his reflection in the window glass. She knocked at the frame, which she was not required to do, and he turned, and she saw the small wariness with which he met every interruption, as though each one might be a fresh demand he had no resource left to meet. She set the letter on the rent roll between his hands. She told him, in the flat, plain way she had learned from copying his own letters back to him, where it had come from, and how long it had been gone, and what was added in pencil beneath the solicitor's direction. She watched him read the 3 words. She watched the color go out of his face, the way water goes out of a tipped glass. He did not break the seal in front of her. He asked her, his voice level, to send to town for the solicitor. Then he asked her to stay. Both requests were unusual. She did neither, and both, sending the groom and remaining by the door. And they waited together in a silence that had a shape to it, and neither of them said the thing they were both turning over, which was that a letter does not say she must know, unless there is a she who has been kept from knowing. The solicitor came 2 days later, a careful elderly man named Branscombe, who had drawn the old Earl's will, and who arrived white about the lips when he understood that the lost letter had been found. He read it first alone. Then he asked for the Earl, and for Mirabel, and the Dowager, hearing that a closed door had assembled 3 people without her, came too, uninvited, in dove-gray silk with the family pearls at her throat, and seated herself as though the seat had been kept for her. The Dowager was Lady Selvan, and she had been the wife of the old Earl's younger brother, dead these 10 years, and she had lived at Ensley through 2 reigns of it, as the only fixed point, while heirs came and went. She was 61, handsome still, with a back like a poker and a mind like a steel trap kept oiled. And she loved this house the way a sentry loves a wall, which is to say she would defend it without ever once asking whether the thing behind the wall deserved defending. She looked at the letter in Branscome's hands, she looked at Mirabel by the door. And something passed across her face, quick as a swallow over water, that Mirabel could not read and would spend a long while afterward wishing she had. What the letter said, when Branscome at last read it aloud, was this: that the old Earl, as a young man before he had come into the title, had married, that the marriage was real, witnessed, and entered in the register of a small parish in the north, where his regiment had been quartered, that his bride had been a gentleman's daughter of no fortune, and that his own father, the old Earl's father, had forced the matter into silence, had separated them, had let it be put about that the young woman was dead, and had married his son a second time to a great heiress, the marriage everyone knew, that the first wife had not died then, that she had borne a daughter, that she had died years later in poverty rather than shame, the man she still, against all sense, loved, and that the daughter, the only legitimate child of the old Earl's only valid marriage, had been placed quietly, under another name, in the care of a man the Earl trusted, and raised as that man's own. The room was very quiet. Branscome's voice, when it went on, had gone thin. The daughter, the letter said, had been given to the keeping of a gentleman named Corburn of Westcote, and christened under his name, and called his child, and had never been told. Mirabel did not understand it at first. She heard the name of her father's house, and her father's name, and felt only a strange, cold confusion, as though someone had read out a sentence in a language she half knew. Then she understood. All at once, the way you understand the depth of cold water only after you have already gone under. The man she had called father had not been her father. The godfather who took her in had not taken her in out of charity. He had taken her home, and he had died with the words on his lips unsaid, and entrusted them to a letter. And the letter had sat in a wicker basket for a year while she dusted the spines of his books and answered to clerk girl. She put her hand against the doorframe. She did not weep. She would not weep in front of the dowager, who was watching her with an attention that had nothing of pity in it. You may need a moment here. She did. Take it, and then come back. Because what the dowager did next is the heart of the thing. Lady Selvain rose. She said, in a voice of perfect smoothness, that it was a touching tale and a great pity, and that it was, of course, entirely unprovable. The maundering of a dying man who had grown sentimental about a pretty dependent at the end. She said that a letter was not a register, and a register in a remote northern parish was not a thing anyone could be expected to produce, and that the estate could not be overturned, the title could not be unseated, the law could not be set spinning, on the strength of a sealed confession, a year stale and conveniently arrived to enrich the very young woman who had carried it into the room. She said she was sorry for the clerk girl, truly, but the clerk girl must see how it looked. The clerk girl, the third voicing of it, and the cruelest, because this time it was meant to do legal work, to reduce a daughter to a schemer with a single repeated noun, the dismissive label, spoken once in private to a baroness, spoken once across a dinner table when Mirabel had corrected a date the dowager had got wrong, and now spoken here, in the room where her birth was being read aloud, to bury that birth under it. Branscome looked unhappy and said the register could be sought. The dowager said the register could be sought, by all means, and meanwhile the estate would go on as it was, and she would write to town herself to set matters in their proper order. And Caspar, who had not spoken, who had sat through the whole reading with his eyes fixed on the letter and his hands flat on the table, lifted his head and looked at Mirabel across the room, and she could not read his face at all. That night she could not sleep, and she went down to the muniment room, because the muniment room was the one place in the house that had never stopped being hers. and she stood among the great presses of documents she herself had ordered over 6 years, every deed and lease and rent roll and letter book, ordered by her own hand in a system only she fully understood, and she thought about what the Dowager had said. Unprovable. A register in a remote northern parish. And she remembered something. 2 winters past, the old Earl had asked her to copy out for his private keeping a great quantity of his early papers, regimental things, letters from his soldiering years, the records of a young man's life, before the title. She had copied them all, in her careful hand, into a calf-bound book that she had then shelved among the family memoranda, because that was where such a book belonged. And among those papers, she remembered now, with a jolt that brought her upright in the dark, had been a copy, in the old Earl's own young hand, of an entry from a parish register in the north. A marriage entry. 2 names, a date, the names of 2 witnesses, and the name of the parish. She had copied it without understanding it. She had thought it some legal nicety of his soldiering days. She had filed it under the year, because the date told her where it belonged, and she had forgotten it utterly. Until this moment she found the calf-bound book in 4 minutes. She had filed it well. There in the old Earl's hand, copied by hers, was the entry, the marriage. The parish named in full. The 2 witnesses named in full, and beside one of them, in the Earl's pencil, a note of where that witness might still be found, a sergeant pension to a village not 30 miles distant. It was not the register itself. It was, however, a copy made years before any letter was lost, shelved. Years before anyone could have known it would matter. In a system the Dowager did not understand, and could not have tampered with, witnessed by the consistency of 6 years of Mirabel's own dated work surrounding it on every side. A forgery she might have been accused of, yet no one forges a single page, and then files it, 2 winters early, in the precise sequence of 200 other pages, against a need they cannot foresee. She held the book, and understood that she held the proof, and understood in the same breath that the proof was only as safe as the room it sat in, and that the Dowager had said she would write to town herself, to set matters in their proper order. She was right to be afraid. In the days that followed, the Dowager moved, with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has run this house through every crisis it has known. A man came from town, presented as a clerk from Branscome's chambers, who was not from Branscome's chambers at all. As Mirabel learned by the simple expedient of reading the inn's book where he had signed his true name, he asked, with great courtesy, to be shown the family memoranda on the Earl's business, he said. The Dowager gave the order. Mirabel showed him a press of memoranda. She did not show him the right one. She had spent the previous night moving the calf-bound book, wrapped in oilcloth like the letter that started it all, into the one place in the house no inventory listed, a gap behind the false back of the old Earl's own document box, a hiding place the old Earl had shown her himself, laughing. The winter he taught her the house's secrets, across the chessboard. The false clerk searched for 2 days, working down one press and up the next, lifting out bundles tied in faded tape, and setting them back not quite as he had found them. And Mirabel watched him from her copying stool with her pen going steadily, and her heart going otherwise, noting which drawers he opened and in what order, so that she might know afterward exactly what the Dowager had wished found. He grew short-tempered by the second afternoon. He asked her sharply whether this was the whole of the family papers, and she answered, with the flat courtesy she had learned from copying an Earl's letters, that it was all the memoranda the press contained, which was true, and told him nothing. He found a great deal of nothing. The Dowager, when he left empty-handed, smiled at Mirabel across the hall with a new and careful attention. The smile of a duelist who has discovered her opponent can also fence. Then the Dowager produced her own document. It appeared on a Tuesday, brought down to the library by her own hand, a codicil, she said, to the old Earl's will found among her late husband's papers, in which the old Earl 10 years before his death had expressly disavowed any prior connection, and named his cousin Caspar his heir beyond all dispute. with a particular clause repudiating any claim that might be advanced by any dependent of the house. It was on the right paper. It bore a seal. It named no names, but cast its shadow precisely where a name would fall. And it was. Mirabel saw the instant she was permitted to hold it. Wrong, because the hand that had written the body of it had formed its terminal letters in a way the old Earl never did, and because the seal, though the right seal, had been pressed into wax of a color the old Earl never used, a hard modern vermilion he had disliked. Having always kept to a particular dull oxblood, she had reordered for him twice a year for 6 years, and could have matched in the dark. It was a forgery. It was a good forgery. And it was, she understood, the Dowager's active hand at last made visible, no longer merely suppressing the truth but manufacturing a lie to bury it, and it would stand unless someone could prove it false. And the only person in the house who could prove it false was the clerk girl, whose word against a Dowager Countess was worth precisely nothing. That was the dark of it. That was the lowest point. She sat in the muniment room that night, with the true book hidden behind the false back of a box, and the false codicil filed in the open, where everyone could see it, and she understood that she had the truth, and no standing, the proof, and no voice, the right, and no power. A single candle burned low at her elbow, and she watched the wax run down it the way the Dowager's vermilion had run too hot, too bright, the wrong color entirely, and she thought how strange it was that she could see the lie plain as day, and could not make a single soul in that house believe her eyes over a countess's word. The law would not listen to a clerk girl. The gentry would not. A copyist's testimony against a dowager's pearls was a thing the magistrate would weigh once and set aside. And the one man whose listening might have mattered had sat through her unmaking with his face shut like a door and had not crossed the room. She had spent 6 years learning that to be useful was a kind of safety, that a woman who could find any document and forge none and ask for nothing would be kept. She understood now that being kept and being seen were not the same thing, and that she had mistaken the first for the second. For the whole of her time in this house, she thought of leaving. She had a copyist's hand and a steady character. She could find a position in town, teaching, or copying for a publisher, and never again be called by a name that meant nothing. She got as far as folding 2 gowns into the small trunk she had brought from Westcote 6 years before. Then she took them out again, and she set the blue ribbon she could not remember her mother by back into its drawer, and she understood that she was not going to run. Not because she was brave, but because the old Earl had filed the truth in her keeping. And a thing filed in your keeping is a thing you do not abandon to the damp. What she did not know, that night, was that Caspar had not been silent because he doubted her. He had been silent because he had recognized, the moment the letter was read, that every acre under his feet and every coin in his name belonged by right to the woman standing in his doorway with her hand against the frame, and that a man cannot in the same hour learn he is a usurper and protest, lest the second be heard. As a bid to keep the first, he had spent his year of the title feeling like a man wearing another's coat. Now he knew whose. And he had gone to town himself quietly, while the false clerk searched and the dowager smiled, and he had ridden 30 miles to a village to find a pensioned sergeant, whose name he did not yet know he could have read in a calf-bound book, and he had found the man, and the man remembered the wedding and would swear to it. He had not told Mirabel. He had not told anyone. He had learned in a year of being managed by his aunt the value of a card kept face down. The reckoning came on a gray afternoon in the second week, when Branscombe returned from town with 2 clerks and a magistrate of the county, summoned, everyone assumed, by the dowager, to put the matter of the codicil and the claim to formal rest. The assembly gathered in the library, which was the largest room and the room where the old Earl had spent his life, its floor-to-ceiling shelves rising into shadow, the long table set out, candles lit against the early autumn dark, though it was scarcely 4 o'clock. The dowager wore the family pearls. The gentry of the neighborhood, who had heard a great deal and understood little, filled the chairs along the walls. Leh! and Mirabel was sent for as the clerk girl is sent for to fetch a paper. And she came, and stood at the foot of the table, where she had stood 1,000 times to hand documents up to her betters. The dowager opened it. She addressed the magistrate. She spoke of the sad confusion that a stale letter had thrown the house into, of the duty she felt to her late husband's family to see the succession secure, of the codicil that settled the matter beyond question, which she now laid before the magistrate with her own hand. She did not look at Mirabel. She did not need to. She was a woman who had run this house through every storm, and she believed, with the whole force of a life spent believing it, that the order she defended was the natural order, and that the clerk girl was a flaw in it that would presently be filed away. The magistrate took up the codicil. Branscombe leaned to read it. And it was then, in the held breath of the room, that Caspar stood. He did not raise his voice. He had never in a year raised his voice. He said that before the magistrate ruled, the court should hear from the only person in the house who knew its papers, and he asked Mirabel Corburn to come and stand beside him at the head of the table. The room turned. The dowager's head came round, and Mirabel, who had been summoned to fetch, and not to speak, walked the length of the long table under the eyes of every person of consequence in the county, and took the place he made for her at his right hand where no clerk girl stood. She told it plainly, because plainness was the only voice she trusted. She told the magistrate of the calf-bound book, copied 2 winters before any letter was lost, and she sent for it, and the false back of the old Earl's document box gave it up, oilcloth and all, and the marriage entry was read out in the old Earl's own young hand, the parish named, the witnesses named. She gave the name of the pensioned sergeant, and the village where he might be found. And then, because the codicil still lay on the table casting its shadow, she did the thing the dowager had not foreseen. She asked the magistrate to compare the wax. She set beside the codicil 3 letters from the old Earl's own letter book, all sealed in his life, all in the dull oxblood she had reordered twice a year for 6 years. And she set against them the hard modern vermilion of the codicil's seal, and she named the color, and named the chandler in town who had supplied the oxblood, who could be ridden to, and she pointed, without triumph, to the terminal letters of the codicil's hand, and to the same letters in 3 genuine documents. And she let the magistrate's own eyes do the rest. She did not accuse the dowager. She did not need to. She laid the true beside the false, and stepped back, and the false could not bear the company. The magistrate was a slow, careful man, and he took his time. He compared the hands. He compared the wax. He sent a clerk to the inn-book to confirm that a man calling himself Branscombe's clerk had signed a different name. He read the marriage entry twice, and the room watched the dowager's face, which had been a wall, begin to show the fine cracks that run through a wall before it gives. She tried once more. She said the book might have been written at any time, that the clerk girl had the run of the papers, and the skill to forge 100 such entries. And it was Branscombe of all people, careful Branscombe, who answered her, saying that he himself had inventoried the family memoranda 18 months past, before ever the letter was lost, and had seen and noted that very calf-bound book in its place in the sequence, and could produce his inventory, and that no power on earth could forge a page into the middle of a bound, and inventoried book 2, winters before the need for it arose. The proof was not the page. The proof was the years of honest work around the page, every dated leaf of it in Mirabel's hand, a wall of ordinary labor that no single lie could be slipped inside. The dowager sat down. It was the only sign she gave. She did not weep or rail. She was a woman whose script had worked in every room she had ever entered, and she had at last entered the one room where it did not. She sat very straight, the pearls rising and falling at her throat a little faster than before. And she understood, before anyone said it, that she had lost. Her interior, in that moment, was a single cold calculation that came to nothing. There was no further card to play, and she had played them all. The magistrate gave his, finding the codicil, was rejected as spurious. The marriage entry, supported by the inventory, and to be confirmed by the register and the surviving witness, was admitted as evidence of a valid prior marriage and a legitimate issue. The estate of Ensley, by the plain words of the entail, descended not to the cousin, but to the only legitimate child of the last Earl's only lawful marriage. The clerk girl was the heir. She had been the heir for a year, and for 6 years before that, she had copied the house's truth into safety with her own hands against the day it would need her, never knowing the truth was her own. It was then that Caspar Merivale crossed the room. He had been standing at the head of the table the whole while, and the distance between them was no more than a yard. But he crossed it as a man crosses a frontier, and the room went still in the way. A room goes still when it knows it is about to see the thing it came to see. He stopped before her. He did not kneel. The niche of his rank did not bend that way, and she would not have wanted it. He looked at her with the slate-gray eyes that had been shut against her for a year and were not shut now, and the contained jaw that the household had called cold moved once, as though words cost him, which they did. There was a beat of described silence, the candles guttering, the gentry leaning, the dowager straight and gray at the table's foot. Then he said her name, not the clerk girl, not Miss Corburn even, which was the name the false father had given her. He said, "My lady," and gave her the title that was hers. And then, into the silence that the title made, he said the line, short and irrevocable, the only line the whole hour had been built to hold. "The house is yours. I would be yours also." It was 12 words, and not one more, spoken in the same room where she had been called the clerk girl, and had claimed nothing for himself and offered everything of himself. And it was a man who had spent a year wearing another's coat, laying the coat down and asking with empty hands to be kept for what remained. She heard it. She felt the heat come into her face, the heat she had refused herself through every reading and every label. And her hand, which had been steady through the comparison of wax and the reading of the entry, was not steady now. She did not give him a speech in return. She had learned plainness from his own letters. She said only that the house had been hers all along and she had not known it, and that she had known her own heart longer and had only not been permitted to say so. And she put her ungloved hand into his, there before the magistrate and the county, and the woman who had called her a flaw to be filed away, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough. The dowager left within the week. There was no scene. Daxper settled on her the dower house at the edge of the park, and an income that was generous beyond what the law required, and far beyond what her conduct had earned, and he did it, Mirabel knew, because she asked him to, and she asked him to because a woman corrected is not a woman who must be destroyed, and because the old Earl, who had forgiven the father that ruined his first marriage, had filed mercy in her keeping, along with the truth. The dowager came to take her leave stiffly, in the hall, the pearls at her throat, for the last time in that house, and she looked at Mirabel for a long moment, and what she said was not an apology, because she was not a woman who could shape one, but it was the nearest thing her whole life had left her able to say. "I did not think," she said, "that the filing would matter." And Mirabel, who understood her better than the dowager would ever have allowed, said that it had always mattered, and that was all. And the carriage took her down the avenue, under the bare autumn trees. The register was found that winter, in the north, exactly where the calf-bound book had said it would be, and the pensioned sergeant came south in the spring at Caspar's expense and swore his oath before the magistrate. The down an old soldier weeping without shame to speak at last of a wedding he had stood witness to 40 years before, and thought the world had agreed to forget. The law set its slow seal on what the labor of an unregarded woman had already made true. Mirabel did not attend the swearing. She had no need of it. She had known the truth since the night she found the book in 4 minutes in the dark because she had filed it well. They were married in the chapel beneath which the old Earl lay, on a morning of thin gold light, with the frost again on the gravel and the few who loved them filling the small cold space, and there was no crowd and no spectacle. Only the joining of 2 contained people who had each spent a long while believing they were not permitted the thing they most wanted. Afterward she walked alone for a while in the muniment room which she did not intend to give up, because a house's truth should be kept by someone who loves it, and she ran her ink-stained fingers along the spine she had dusted for 6 years as a servant, and would now keep as their owner, and she found that her feeling was not triumph. It was something quieter and older. It was the feeling of a thing set right. On the last evening of that first autumn, as the lady of the house, she went up to the north wing to the small room that had been hers when she was the clerk girl, and she opened the drawer where the blue ribbon lay, the one thing she had of a mother she could not remember, and now knew the whole sad history of a gentleman's daughter, of no fortune, who had died poor, rather than shame the man she loved. She took the ribbon out and held it to the last of the window light, the worn blue of it, the small particular warmth of it, and she understood at last whose hands had tied it, and why a goddaughter taken in out of charity had been given the run of a library and spoken to as an equal across a chessboard on winter evenings. She had been loved the whole time. She had simply not been told. Caspar found her there in the dusk, with the ribbon in her hand and her face turned to the cold glass, and he did not speak, and he did not need to. He stood beside her at the window with his hand flat against the pane, the old habit testing whether the world were real, and she put her hand over his on the cold glass and found that it was. Below them, the frost came down again over the park and the bare trees and the long avenue. Somewhere in the muniment room a calf-bound book sat in its place, in the sequence, no longer a secret, filed where it belonged, and the house was quiet, and it was theirs, and the ribbon was warm in her hand. If the slow setting right of a quiet woman's worth has stayed with you to the end of it, hold the ribbon a moment in your own thoughts before you go, and remember that the truest things are often the longest unread